It was a warm summer night in 1991 when everything changed for the Marshall family. The house had already gone quiet. The crickets outside chirped softly, the hum of the ceiling fan echoed down the hallway, and in the bedroom painted with soft shades of pink, 6-year-old Angela Marshall lay curled up under her favorite blanket, holding her beloved stuffed rabbit. Her mother, Diane, had just finished tucking her in and whispering good night. Angela had yawned, smiled sleepily, and said she'd see her in the morning. But morning came, and Angela was gone. The nightmare began sometime between midnight and dawn. There was no sign of forced entry. The front door was locked, the windows were closed, and nothing in the house was disturbed except for the small, empty bed at the end of the hallway. Panic set in quickly. Diane screamed, waking up the neighbors, while Angela's father, Mark, rushed through the house calling her name over and over again, searching every closet, every corner, even under the furniture. But Angela had vanished. The police were called immediately. A missing child report was filed, and within hours, search teams flooded the area. Volunteers combed the woods, helicopters hovered above, and flyers with Angela's innocent smile began appearing on telephone poles, store windows, and gas stations across town. News reporters showed up on the lawn, broadcasting live as Diane stood frozen on the porch, clutching Angela's stuffed rabbit, eyes hollow and full of disbelief. Weeks passed, then months. But there were no answers. No clues. No witnesses. Angela had simply disappeared without a trace. The small town in Michigan where they lived was turned upside down. It didn't make sense. How could a little girl vanish from her bed in the middle of the night while her parents were just down the hall? Over time, the media frenzy faded. Tips slowed. The posters yellowed in the rain. And for most people, life went on. But for Diane, time stood still. She refused to move Angela's things. Her room remained just as it was the night she disappeared, her books on the shelf, her clothes still folded in drawers, and her toys resting quietly in corners of the room. Every birthday, Diane lit a candle. Every Christmas, she hung up Angela's stocking. Some people told her it was time to let go. But how do you let go of your child? The years crawled by. Diane and Mark's marriage began to crumble under the weight of silence and sorrow. They blamed themselves, each other, and the endless what-ifs. Eventually, Mark moved out. Diane stayed, alone, in the house that once echoed with laughter and bedtime stories. Alone with the memories and the ache that never really faded. Then, 9 years later, just when the world had nearly forgotten Angela Marshall, a sound broke through the silence that had lived in that house for so long. It happened on a rainy afternoon in April. Diane had been cleaning out the attic, not because she was ready to move on, but because something inside her said it was time to face the things she'd been avoiding. That's when she found it, Angela's old see and say toy. You might remember it, the round, colorful toy with a little handle you pull, and it plays different animal sounds. Diane held it in her hands, wiped off the dust, and for a moment, just stared. Then, almost on impulse, she pulled the handle. The toy made the familiar clicking noise, then the soft, mechanical voice came alive. The cow says moo. Diane smiled for the first time in what felt like years. But when she pulled it again, something happened. Instead of the usual animal sound, a strange voice played. Faint. Muffled. Not part of the original toy's recording. Diane's smile faded. She pulled it again. And again. Each time, the same distorted message. A voice, small, fragile, and trembling. Mommy, if you hear this. I'm still here. Diane's blood ran cold. She froze, staring at the toy in disbelief. She pulled the handle again, pressing it close to her ear. The message repeated, clearer this time, as if someone had recorded over the original toy's sound. It's me. Angela, her heart pounded in her chest. She dropped the toy, stumbled back, and just stood there. She didn't know if she was hallucinating, if grief had finally played its cruelest trick. But she wasn't hearing things. The voice was real. The words were unmistakable, and it sounded like Angela. Authorities were called, and the toy was immediately taken in for analysis. Audio experts confirmed what Diane already knew in her gut, that it wasn't part of the original manufacturer's recording. It had been tampered with. Someone had managed to record a new message on a toy that, by all technical accounts, shouldn't have been able to hold or replay custom audio. That raised even more questions. Who recorded it? When? How did it get back into Diane's attic? And, most importantly, where was Angela? The case, long considered cold, was suddenly alive again. Investigators reopened the file, retracing old steps, rechecking statements. The toy became the center of the investigation, and Diane, once again, found herself staring down the long, uncertain road of hope and heartbreak. But this time, there was a sliver of something she hadn't felt in nearly a decade: possibility. Word spread fast. News stations picked up the story. Headlines read, "Missing girl's voice allegedly found on toy 9 years later." People across the country tuned in, drawn by the chilling mystery. Online forums lit up with theories, some practical, some bizarre. Was it really Angela? Was it a hoax? Could someone have broken into the house and planted the toy? And if Angela was alive, where had she been all this time? Diane didn't care about the headlines. She didn't care about the skeptics. In her heart, she believed it was her daughter. A mother knows. There was a softness in the voice, a tiny inflection only she would recognize. And there was fear. Angela had been trying to reach her. She had left a message, somehow, hoping it would be found. But how could a message like that have ended up on a toy hidden in the attic? And why now, after 9 long, silent years? As investigators worked behind the scenes, Diane started piecing together her own theory, going back through old memories, strange occurrences, people who had come in and out of their lives. There was one name that kept coming to mind. Someone who had been close to the family back then. Someone who disappeared not long after Angela did. And that's where things start to take a much darker turn. Because once Diane follows that trail, she begins to uncover secrets that had been buried for years. And the truth? It's far more twisted than anyone could have imagined. But before we get into what Diane found and what really happened to Angela, you need to hear the rest of the story. Because this toy, this single, dusty toy in the attic, didn't just play a message. It opened a door. And what was waiting on the other side will chill you to your core. Diane couldn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table, staring at the sea in say toy resting beside a cup of untouched tea. The rain tapped softly on the windows. Every few minutes, she would reach out, pull the handle again, and listen. The message never changed. It was always the same voice. Always the same plea. "Mommy, if you hear this, I'm still here." It played like a heartbeat through the house, soft, steady, impossible to ignore. Detectives had already taken a copy of the audio and were running it through voice analysis, comparing it with recordings from Angela's childhood. But Diane didn't need science to tell her what she already believed. It was Angela. Her little girl had somehow reached out, after all these years, through a broken toy that had no business working, let alone carrying a message from the past. She remembered something strange now, something small but unsettling. A few weeks before she found the toy, the attic door had been slightly open one morning. At the time, she thought nothing of it. Maybe it had loosened from the house settling. But now, with everything happening, her mind wouldn't let it go. Had someone been in the house? Had they placed the toy there deliberately, knowing she would find it? And if so, why? Angela's room became the center of everything again. Diane started spending hours in there. She looked through every drawer, every old notebook, even her daughter's coloring books, searching for anything she may have missed all those years ago. She ran her fingers over Angela's drawings, over childish crayon lines and half-written words. They once brought her pain. Now, they felt like breadcrumbs. The investigators began focusing on the people who had been around the Marshalls back in 1991. Family friends, neighbors, teachers, babysitters. One name kept surfacing: Todd Garrison. Back then, Todd had been their neighbor. He was in his late 20s and worked as a mechanic. He lived alone, but was known around the neighborhood for helping out, fixing bikes, changing tires, even babysitting once or twice when Diane had errands. Diane had never fully trusted him. Something about his smile never felt right, but Mark had insisted he was harmless. After Angela disappeared, Todd moved out of town suddenly, just 2 months later. At the time, it didn't seem unusual. People moved all the time. But now, it felt suspicious. Detectives pulled up his old address and began trying to locate him. Meanwhile, Diane asked to see the original evidence file from 1991. The lead investigator hesitated, but eventually agreed to share what was left, yellowed documents, faded photographs, and a few pages of typed statements. As she flipped through the file, one detail made her chest tighten. A report from a neighbor, an elderly woman who lived across the street, had mentioned seeing a man walking up to the marshal's porch late the night Angela disappeared. She thought it was someone delivering a package. The report had never led anywhere. The description was vague, but Diane read that line over and over. He had something under his arm, like a box, or maybe a toy. She felt her throat tighten. What if the toy had been with Angela that night? What if someone had kept it and brought it back? The detective, now fully invested again, agreed it was time to find Todd Garrison. They learned he was living 3 states away, in Ohio, under a different name. He had no criminal record, but something about the sudden name change and relocation raised red flags. They couldn't arrest him without cause, but they could talk to him. Quietly, a small team was sent out to question him. Back at home, Diane noticed something else strange. The voice on the toy didn't just repeat a single message, it changed slightly every few days. One afternoon, instead of, "I'm still here," it said, "He doesn't let me talk much." The next time, it added, "Please find me." It was like the toy was updating, evolving, somehow receiving new messages. Diane told the detective, who immediately arranged to have the toy examined again. They wanted to know if it was connected to any wireless system, but the toy was a basic 90s model. No Bluetooth, no smart tech, nothing modern. The specialists were baffled. There was no logical reason for it to behave this way. No internal recorder. No audio storage. Nothing. And yet, Angela's voice kept coming through. Some believed it was a hoax, that Diane had modified the toy somehow, or someone was playing a cruel trick. But Diane wasn't interested in convincing anyone. She only cared about following the trail, however strange it was. Then came the letter. It arrived in the mail without a return address. Just her name, written in uneven handwriting across the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper. No signature. No greeting. Just a single line. "You're getting closer. Stop before you regret it." Diane took it to the police immediately. They dusted it for fingerprints. Nothing. The envelope had no postmark. Someone had hand-delivered it. Maybe even walked right up to her porch again. The realization sent a fresh wave of fear through her. Who was watching her? Who knew what she had found? And most importantly, what did they have to hide? As the investigation moved forward, more questions surfaced than answers. Another unsettling discovery came from the toy itself. An audio engineer enhanced the original message and filtered the background noise. Beneath Angela's voice, there was a soft mechanical hum, almost like a fan. And then, just for a second, something else. A distant clang, like a metal door shutting. It was faint, but distinct. It sounded like a basement. The theory was grim. Angela might have been kept somewhere all these years. A hidden place. Somewhere sound could travel, but she couldn't. Diane's nightmares returned full force. She couldn't shake the image of her daughter, trapped, scared, alone. Every time she heard that message, it hit her like a fresh wound. But it also gave her purpose. She had to keep going. No matter how painful, no matter how dangerous. Angela's old room became a war room. Diane filled it with maps, photographs, newspaper clippings. Red string connected people, places, timelines. It looked like something out of a detective movie, but for Diane, it was just her way of making sense of chaos. If no one else could find her daughter, then she would. Meanwhile, Todd Garrison was interviewed. He denied knowing anything. He claimed to barely remember the marshals, said he had moved away for work, and that he didn't even recall Angela clearly. But his story didn't sit right. He was too polished, too rehearsed. When asked about the toy, his eyes reportedly twitched, just for a second. But that was enough to open a deeper investigation. The toy, the message, the letter, Todd, somehow, all of it was connected. But the full picture hadn't come into focus yet. Not long after, Diane received another chilling clue. Taped to her front door, in the middle of the night, was a Polaroid. It showed a dark hallway, with what looked like a small shadow at the end of it. The photo was grainy, low light, almost impossible to make out, but Diane knew what she saw. A small figure, curled in the corner, arms wrapped around her knees. It looked like a child. No words. No note. Just the image. She clutched it to her chest, tears streaming down her face. If this was meant to scare her into stopping, It was too late. She wasn't afraid anymore. She was furious, and more determined than ever. Someone knew where Angela was. Someone had been close enough to walk up to her house twice and vanish without a trace. The question wasn't whether Angela was alive anymore. It was, how much longer could they keep her hidden? And just how far would they go to make sure Diane never found out? Because the more she uncovered, the more dangerous things became. And she was only just beginning to dig. Diane stared at the Polaroid for hours, memorizing every grainy shadow, every dark edge of the hallway captured in the image. She taped it to the wall next to her map of leads, right above Angela's school photo. Something in her gut told her the hallway wasn't just any hallway. The shape of the light, the faint glint on the floor, it felt underground. A basement, maybe even a bunker. It wasn't proof, not really. But to a mother starved for answers, it was a direction. The police treated it like a threat, not a lead. They put a car outside her house for 2 nights, but then pulled it when nothing else happened. Diane could feel the shift. They were skeptical again, afraid of looking foolish chasing a 9-year-old cold case just because of a talking toy and a blurry photograph. But she didn't blame them. This wasn't their child. Angela wasn't just a file or a memory to her. She was still real, still somewhere, still waiting. So Diane kept digging. One of the subplots began to take shape when she reconnected with someone she hadn't spoken to in years, her younger sister, Kelly. They hadn't been close since Angela disappeared. Grief had driven a wedge between them. But when Diane shared what had happened, Kelly came straight over, no questions asked. She didn't try to convince Diane to stop. She didn't call her crazy. She just listened. That mattered more than anything. Kelly started helping. They divided up names from the original investigation and began reaching out to people, one by one. Some were reluctant to talk. Others seemed almost relieved that someone was finally asking questions again. One woman, a former neighbor, mentioned something Diane hadn't known. Todd Garrison used to babysit more than just Angela. He'd watched at least 3 other kids in the neighborhood during that same year. Diane contacted each of those families. 2 had moved out of state. 1 still lived nearby. The mother, Mrs. Callahan, hesitated at first but agreed to meet. Over tea at her kitchen table, she lowered her voice and said something that made Diane's blood run cold. "My daughter had nightmares after he watched her," she said. She was only 5, but she started refusing to sleep alone. Said someone watched her through the window at night. "We thought she was just scared, you know?" But now, she didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Diane took notes on everything. Patterns were beginning to form. Little things, easy to dismiss on their own, but together they hinted at something darker. Something hidden. Something that had slipped through the cracks all those years ago. Meanwhile, the toy kept speaking. The voice was now quieter, like it was getting harder for Angela to talk. One night, Diane pulled the handle and heard a new message. "He knows you're looking for me. Please hurry." It was the first time Angela had said anything about he. Diane wrote down every message. She recorded them, played them back for the investigators, but they had no explanation. The toy still baffled every expert who examined it. There was no chip inside that should allow re-recordings. No way for new audio to play unless someone had physically tampered with it. And yet, the voice changed, slowly, day by day. It wasn't looping. It was growing. The conflict deepened when Diane began receiving phone calls at night. The first few times, there was nothing but silence. Then, on the 4th call, a distorted voice whispered one word before hanging up. "Stop." She reported it, of course. But the number was untraceable. The calls kept coming. Not every night, but often enough to rattle her. Kelly suggested changing her number, but Diane refused. She believed whoever was calling might eventually slip up. Give her something. Anything. Then came a new twist. A man named Alex Reyes reached out through a true crime forum that had picked up on Angela's story after local news revived the case. He claimed to have worked with Todd Garrison briefly in Ohio. Said Todd had mentioned having a bad past and once got defensive when someone asked if he had any kids of his own. Diane reached out, and Alex agreed to meet. He seemed nervous. Young, maybe in his early 30s, and clearly shaken. He said Todd had once mentioned Michigan in passing and how he left that town behind for a reason. He also remembered Todd having a strange fascination with electronics. Apparently, he used to tinker with old toys, even ones that weren't working anymore. That detail stopped Diane cold. Could Todd have modified the C and say somehow? Could he have planted it with a recorded message, knowing Diane would find it? But that raised another question. If Todd was the one who took Angela, why leave a message that could lead to her rescue? Unless someone else was helping Angela. Someone on the inside. A possible accomplice, or maybe even a witness. Someone who knew where she was and couldn't speak freely. That changed everything. Diane brought this theory to the detectives, but they were hesitant to act without hard evidence. So she and Kelly began their own search. They focused on areas around where Todd had lived in Ohio, looking for abandoned buildings, old properties, basements, anywhere a person could be hidden or kept out of sight. Diane's world had become a haze of maps, phone calls, and shadows. Every day blended into the next, every hour consumed by the same question that had haunted her for nearly a decade. Where was Angela? With Kelly by her side, she kept pushing, refusing to slow down. Their search expanded beyond Ohio. They looked into properties Todd's old family had once owned, vacant lots, shuttered shops, even hunting cabins in rural Michigan. Anything that could hide someone. Anything that might echo with the sound of Angela's voice, just like in that haunting toy. The messages from the C and say were becoming harder to hear. Angela's voice now crackled with static, and sometimes cut out mid-sentence, like the signal was failing or the toy itself was breaking down. But one night, something chilling happened. Diane pulled the lever, and instead of Angela's voice, there was a different sound. Not words, just a faint, rhythmic tapping. Tap, tap, pause, tap, tap. Kelly recorded it and played it back over and over. It didn't take long to recognize the pattern. It was Morse code. Diane had no idea how to translate it, but Kelly stayed up all night cross-checking it with an online chart. When she finally decoded it, she barely slept a wink. The message was short, just 3 words, below the church. They didn't know what it meant at first. There were dozens of churches near the areas they were searching, but it was a lead, one they couldn't ignore. Diane printed maps and marked every church that had any history with Todd's family, any location he might have known. One stood out. An old, half-abandoned church on the edge of a forgotten Michigan town, surrounded by woods and long since closed down after a roof collapsed years earlier. But Todd's uncle had once owned property nearby. It was remote, quiet, easy to miss, and just close enough to be accessible if someone wanted to hide something or someone. They packed up early the next morning. Diane didn't tell the police. She didn't want to be told to wait, to stop, to let others handle it. She was too close. She could feel it. The air was different now, like the story was finally reaching the edge of its secrets. When they arrived, the church looked even more worn down than they expected. Nature had claimed much of it. Vines covered the walls, windows were shattered, and the surrounding trees stood like sentinels, silent and still. The front doors hung crooked on their hinges. Inside, the air was thick with dust and the smell of old wood. They split up. Diane searched the main hall, while Kelly checked the side rooms. There was nothing at first, just broken pews, scattered hymnals, and birds nesting in the rafters. But then Diane noticed something odd behind the altar. A section of the floor was slightly raised, the wood newer than the rest. She knelt down and ran her hand over it. The boards creaked hollow. She called Kelly over. Together, they pried it open with a rusty crowbar found near the back wall. Beneath the floor was a trapdoor, barely visible. No handle, just a small ring bolted to the center. Diane's hands shook as she pulled it open. A damp, musty smell rose up, cold air, like from underground. They shined a flashlight down. Wooden steps led into darkness. They looked at each other, neither saying a word. Then Diane started down. The basement was small. Concrete walls, low ceiling, and completely silent. They moved slowly, searching every corner. Just when Diane was beginning to think they were wrong, that it was another dead end, she saw something that made her knees buckle. A single white sneaker, child-sized, worn down with a faded sticker of a butterfly on the side. She picked it up with trembling hands. Behind a wall of crates, they found something else. A mattress, blankets, food wrappers, a child's drawing taped to the wall, crude, but unmistakable. A stick figure girl with long brown hair, holding hands with a woman labeled Mom. Kelly gasped. Diane could barely breathe. They were too late. No one was there now. They called the police immediately. Within the hour, the place was crawling with investigators, search dogs, forensics teams. But there was no sign of Angela. Whoever had kept her there was long gone. Still, it was the strongest proof yet that Angela had been alive and close. Then came the most disturbing revelation. In one corner of the basement, behind a loose panel in the wall, police found a box. Inside were VHS tapes, dozens of them, labeled with dates that stretched from the early 90s to as recent as a few months ago. They took them into evidence and started reviewing them. Diane wasn't allowed to see what was on them, but the lead detective came out looking pale. He didn't say much, just that they now had enough to reopen the case fully and bring Todd Garrison in. The tension tightened with every minute. The conflict wasn't just about Angela anymore. It was about exposing something bigger, something that had festered in silence for years. While authorities tracked Todd's movements, Diane kept searching the church. She felt drawn back to the spot where the trapdoor had been. As she walked the perimeter again, she noticed something carved into one of the pews, barely visible beneath layers of dirt and dust. A name. Angela. Scratched in by a child's hand, with uneven lines and a tiny heart at the end. Diane dropped to her knees. She pressed her hand against the letters, her tears falling freely now. Angela had been here. She had survived. She had left clues. That night, Diane stayed awake staring at the toy. It hadn't played any new messages in over a day. She feared it might be done, that whatever connection she had to her daughter through that strange, impossible voice had vanished. But just as she was about to drift into sleep, it whirred to life one more time. This time, the voice wasn't desperate. It was determined. I'm trying to get out. Please don't stop. It was the clearest the message had ever been. Diane sat upright. Her heart thudded in her chest. Angela was still somewhere, and now she was trying to escape. The next morning, everything moved fast. Police had traced Todd's recent purchases, camping gear, a burner phone, a car rental. He was on the move. But more importantly, they traced him to an area not far from the church. A cabin tucked into the woods, inaccessible by normal roads, owned under a shell company with ties to Todd's alias. A team was dispatched immediately. Diane begged to go, but was held back. She stood at the edge of the barricade, clutching Angela's photo, praying, waiting. Hours passed. Then night fell. Helicopters circled. Officers moved in. And then silence. No one had come out. No word. No update. Just the sound of the wind moving through the trees and the lingering question in Diane's mind. Was she finally about to see her daughter? Or was it already too late? The tension hung like a storm in the air. Everything, every clue, every risk, every broken rule had led to this. And now, all Diane could do was wait at the edge of the woods, listening for the one voice that could tell her if the nightmare was about to end, or just beginning. Diane stood under the cold glare of the floodlights, her eyes locked on the thick tree line ahead. The woods beyond the church were dark and dense, swallowing up the silhouettes of the officers who had gone in hours ago. Every rustling branch, every crack of a twig sent her mind racing. She had expected something, movement, a shout, maybe even the sight of someone being led out. But there was nothing. Just silence, like the forest itself was holding its breath. Kelly stayed close, one hand on Diane's shoulder, grounding her. Neither of them spoke much. What was there to say? They had followed a voice from a toy, tracked Morse code tapped out in desperation, and found a place where Angela had been. But now, when the ending felt within reach, it was as if the story had frozen in time. Then, the radio on one of the officers crackled to life. Diane leaned in, straining to hear. Cabin's empty. No sign of Garrison. No girl. Diane's knees nearly gave out. Kelly caught her just in time. Empty? She tried to process the words, but they didn't make sense. How could it be empty? The clues had all pointed here. The purchases, the property, the evidence in the church basement, it was supposed to end here. But the radio spoke again, more quietly this time, almost unsure. We found something. You need to see this. They wouldn't let Diane into the cabin, but one of the detectives came out to meet her. His face was pale, drawn tight. We found evidence someone had been staying here. Food, clothes, drawings. Fresh ones. Same style as before. Diane could barely hear over the pounding of her heart. Angela, she whispered. We think so. But there's something else. He paused, looked over his shoulder. In the basement, we found another trapdoor. It leads to a tunnel. A tunnel. Diane could hardly believe it. A hidden passage, dug beneath the cabin floor, leading deep into the woods. It was narrow, just wide enough for one person to crawl through, and lined with plastic sheeting and old boards. The police followed it for nearly a mile before it opened up near an abandoned service road. There, they found tracks, tire marks, fresh ones. Whoever had used that tunnel had escaped just hours before they arrived. And then came the twist. In the small crawl space under the cabin, tucked in a metal box beneath a loose floorboard, officers found more cassette tapes, recorded audio. Not VHS. These were voice recordings, dozens of them, dated and labeled with odd phrases like Day 14, Listening, or Night 63, Confession. The tapes were sent to forensic audio experts, but a few were played on-site. What they heard changed everything. One of the tapes featured two voices, a man's, deep and calm, and a young girl's, Angela. Only it wasn't just Angela talking. It was her singing, laughing, reading from a children's book. Diane was crushed. Her daughter hadn't just been alive. She'd been kept, controlled, recorded like some kind of twisted project. But the man's voice didn't match Todd Garrison. It was someone else, someone older, someone more calculated, someone who didn't just take Angela, but raised her in captivity like she was part of some sick experiment. And this changed the stakes completely. Because if Todd wasn't the one speaking on those tapes, then he hadn't been acting alone. There was another person, maybe even the one truly in control. The detectives now believed Todd had been a pawn, or worse, an accomplice to someone more dangerous. Someone who had slipped past suspicion for years. Diane felt sick thinking about it. How close they had come. How long Angela had lived under that stranger's roof. A girl with no voice, but the one that whispered through a broken toy. The realization set off a wave of renewed urgency. The case exploded in the media. News outlets ran headlines like New Audio Reveals Second Suspect in 1991 Abduction and Mother's Toy Reveals Disturbing Clues in Cold Case. But the attention also made things more dangerous. Diane began getting letters. Handwritten, no return address. They weren't threatening exactly, but they were strange. One read, "The voice isn't hers anymore." Another said, "Stop before you lose her again." The handwriting didn't match Todd's. Investigators were working on identifying it, but results would take time. Meanwhile, the toy, Angela C. Insay, spoke again. Only this time, it didn't use her voice. It was distorted, male, rough, and deliberate. "She belongs here now. Stop digging." Diane dropped the toy in shock. It rolled under the couch, still and quiet. The police took it in for testing again, trying to find out if it had been tampered with, remotely altered, maybe. But the truth was, they had no answers. And for Diane, the questions just kept growing. Who was this second man? How did he gain control over Todd? Why keep Angela alive? And what was his plan now that the world was watching? Kelly suggested the possibility of a cult. Maybe an underground group who used children, who trained them, erased their identities. It was a terrifying thought, but not impossible. The recordings, the isolation, the manipulation, it all pointed towards something bigger than a lone predator. Then another lead emerged. A former employee at a children's home came forward. She claimed she recognized Angela's face, older but unmistakable, from a flyer circulated during the media storm. The woman remembered a quiet girl brought in under a fake name around 1999. She'd stayed only a few weeks before being picked up by a man posing as her uncle. No ID, no paperwork, just charm and a signature. When shown pictures of Todd Garrison, the woman shook her head. It wasn't him. The trail was heating up again. Someone had moved Angela. Carefully, repeatedly. She'd been passed between identities, hidden in plain sight, which meant she might have seen dozens of places, dozens of people, and every time, she may have tried to leave behind a sign. Diane went back to the audio tapes, listening closely. One tape had the sound of birds chirping, then a faint chime, like a clock tower. She played it for an investigator, who cross-referenced the chime with recordings from public buildings. Eventually, they identified it as coming from a park clock in northern Indiana. Another breadcrumb. The search shifted again. The FBI got involved. Posters went up. Tips flooded in. But it was Diane's obsession that brought the next break. She played one of Angela's old songs over and over, the same one that came through the sea months ago. One day, she noticed a strange hum in the background, like static, but steady, almost rhythmic. Kelly took the audio to a sound engineer, who isolated the tone. It matched a frequency used by a now-defunct radio station, a pirate signal that had only broadcast within a 5-mile range during the early 2000s in a specific part of southern Illinois. Diane didn't even hesitate. She packed a bag and went. The abandoned tower still stood, half collapsed, surrounded by rusted metal and broken fences. And nearby, tucked behind a row of thick brush, was a tiny shack. Inside, she found children's clothes, drawings, crayons, a stack of books, and scratched into the wooden wall, just barely visible, still here. Diane dropped to the floor, overcome. Angela had been there recently, but as she turned to leave, she noticed something else. A wire. Fresh. Someone had been here after Angela, and they weren't far ahead. The chase was no longer about following a ghost. It was about catching a man who believed Angela belonged to him, and who was always one step ahead. The story was no longer just a mystery. It was a race, and time was running out. Diane stayed in the shack long after the sun dipped below the trees, the cold air pressing in around her like a weight. She ran her hand across the carved initials on the wall, still here. And whispered her daughter's name under her breath, as if saying it out loud might draw her closer. Angela had been there, maybe just days before. And whoever had taken her, whoever was still moving her like a shadow through the country, hadn't gone far. Diane didn't want to leave the shack, but she knew staying meant losing more time. She snapped photos, marked the location, and drove straight to the nearest police department. This time, law enforcement moved faster. The evidence was strong, and the location was near an old hunting preserve that had long been unregulated, full of hidden trails and forgotten structures. FBI teams swept the area. Drones flew overhead. Thermal scans picked up something just off a rocky cliff, an old storm shelter buried beneath vines and brush. Diane wasn't allowed close, but she refused to stay back entirely. She waited at the tree line, eyes locked on the hill. Kelly was on the phone nearby, pacing, giving updates to the private investigator they'd kept in the loop. And then the radios lit up. Movement inside. 2 figures. One adult. One small, possibly a teenager. They moved in fast. Officers surrounded the entrance. There was a moment of standoff, no answer to their calls, no sound. Then, suddenly, the door cracked open. A man stepped out. It wasn't Todd Garrison. It was someone no one had expected. A retired pediatric therapist named Walter Kinnell. He'd worked at a facility in the early 90s, the same one where Angela was briefly seen by that former employee. He was clean-shaven, wearing a gray sweater and jeans, looking more like a grandfather than a kidnapper. Calm. Almost too calm. "I'm the only one she trusts," he said quietly. "Please, don't frighten her." Officers rushed past him, into the shelter. A few tense minutes later, one of them came back out, carrying a girl. She was thin. Her clothes were worn. Her eyes darted around, wild and uncertain. She flinched at every movement. But when Diane saw her, there was no question. It was Angela, her baby girl. Diane didn't wait. She ran forward, breaking past the barrier, falling to her knees as Angela was slowly led toward her. There was a hesitation in the girl's steps, as if she wasn't sure if it was real. Diane reached out, tears spilling freely. "Angela," she whispered. "It's Mom. I'm here." Angela froze. Then, slowly, she took a step forward. Her hand brushed against Diane's cheek. Her lips trembled. And then, in a hoarse whisper, she said the word Diane had waited almost 10 years to hear. "Mom." The world fell away. Nothing else existed in that moment. Just a mother and daughter, broken but together again. They took Angela to the hospital immediately. Diane never left her side. Doctors ran tests, psychologists asked questions, but Diane didn't push. She just held her hand, brushed her hair, and sat quietly, letting Angela lead. The details that followed were difficult to hear, and some Diane may never fully know. Angela had been taken by Todd, yes, but not for money or revenge. He delivered her to Walter, who had convinced him that Angela needed a better life, away from the pain and neglect of the world. Todd had his own demons and had been manipulated, perhaps blackmailed. But Walter was the mastermind. He built a false world for Angela, taught her new names, new stories, isolated her, used her voice to make recordings, to test her memory, to control her reality. The see and say hadn't just been a toy. It had been a tool, something Walter used to condition her, but that Angela had managed to hijack in tiny, courageous ways. The voice messages hadn't been supernatural. They were recorded years ago, tied to a basic signal frequency that Angela had somehow used to communicate through the toy after finding a hidden transmitter Walter had forgotten to disable. It was risky, dangerous, but it was her only way to reach out. Angela had risked everything just to say, "I'm here." Diane thought the worst was over. Her daughter was safe. Walter was in custody. Todd was caught trying to flee the state and taken in for questioning. It felt like the story was finally ending. But then came the twist. One night, while Angela was asleep, Diane sat with Kelly and the lead investigator in a quiet waiting room. The agent looked uneasy. He handed Diane a folder. Inside were records, photos, letters, therapy logs, and a single ID card. The girl in the photo looked exactly like Angela. But the name wasn't Angela. It was Emily Burns. The investigator spoke gently, like he was stepping around landmines. "We believe Walter may have abducted other children before Angela, possibly even switched their identities. There's a chance, a small one, but real, that the girl you found may not be your biological daughter." Diane couldn't breathe. "No," she whispered. "That's my daughter. We're running DNA to confirm. But in the meantime, we found a hidden room in Walter's home. Documents, recordings, mentions of two girls." Diane's head spun. She remembered the cassette labeled Night 63, Confession. Could it have been someone else speaking? Could the Angela she found be one of two? The DNA tests took days. Diane didn't know how to feel. Angela, Emily, was real. Her emotions, her memories, the way she looked at Diane, it was all real. And yet, if there was another girl still missing, another family still waiting, the story wasn't over. When the results finally came in, they were both relieving and heartbreaking. The girl was Angela. Her DNA matched. She was Diane's daughter. But the file had another name, one scribbled in a margin of Walter's journal. Emily transferred. Failed compliance. Diane looked at Kelly, her voice low. There was another girl. Angela wasn't the only one. And now, a new search began, for a child who had vanished just like Angela, possibly still out there, under a false name, in someone else's version of a twisted life. Diane knew she couldn't stop now. If Angela had been brave enough to reach out through static and silence, to leave breadcrumbs and risk her captor's wrath, then Diane owed it to that other girl too. The story had reached its climax, but a shadow still lingered. As Angela healed, piece by piece, Diane sat by her side, knowing full well that not every ending is clean. But she had her daughter back. And this time, she wasn't letting go. Some stories don't end with answers. They end with purpose. And Diane's had just found a new one. Weeks passed, and the hospital room that once echoed with machines and hushed concerns slowly began to feel like a place of healing. Angela, though still quiet, started opening up more. She drew pictures again, at first just lines and colors, but eventually, figures appeared. A small girl standing beside a tall tree. A woman with brown hair holding her hand. Diane knew who those drawings were meant to be. The bond between them was rebuilding, not rushed, but real, and every moment mattered. Therapists worked gently with Angela, helping her recover memories that had been tucked away or distorted. Some came back in flashes, like the scent of her mother's perfume, or the way her bedroom looked when she was 4. Others returned in fragments that didn't always make sense, but were pieces of her truth. Diane listened patiently, never pushing too hard. She knew Angela's world had been shattered more than once, and her job now was to help her rebuild it, piece by piece. Todd Garrison, under pressure and the weight of overwhelming evidence, eventually confessed. His role had started with the delivery, a favor he convinced himself was noble, twisted by Walter's manipulation. He claimed he thought Angela was being rescued from a broken home, lies Walter had fed him to justify the unthinkable. But over time, Todd saw the truth and chose silence over action. That silence cost Angela 9 years. He was sentenced without appeal. Diane didn't feel relief exactly, but she felt finality. There would be no more running, no more hiding. As for Walter Kinnell, the investigation into his past uncovered a chilling pattern. There had been others, at least 2 cases suspected but not confirmed. He had worked in various therapy centers, mostly with children, leaving just before scrutiny could catch up. Records were missing, files altered, and identities erased or rewritten. He had been methodical, not just in hiding Angela but in building a version of reality he could control. Psychologists who evaluated him called him high-functioning, deeply manipulative, and dangerously delusional. He would never see the outside world again. The mystery girl, Emily, was never found. But Diane kept her name alive. She added a second frame drawing to her living room wall, one of Angela's early sketches of a girl with a red ribbon in her hair. Diane didn't know who she was, not exactly, but she knew that someone out there might still be waiting for her. If Angela had survived, maybe Emily had too. Maybe someone was still searching, just like she had. Angela's see and say, the toy that started it all, was returned by investigators once it had been examined and cleared. Diane thought about throwing it away, burying it with all the pain it had carried. But Angela asked to keep it. Not because she wanted to play with it, but because it was proof that even when no one was listening, she had found a way to speak. She put it on a shelf in her room, next to her books and new art supplies. She didn't press its buttons anymore, but she looked at it sometimes. A reminder that even in silence, her voice had mattered. News coverage died down slowly. Reporters moved on, the cameras disappeared, and the story faded from the headlines. But for Diane, nothing faded. Every day with Angela was a miracle she hadn't dared to believe she'd ever have again. They cooked dinner together, walked through the neighborhood, and sometimes just sat outside watching the wind in the trees. Angela was still cautious around strangers, still learning how to navigate the world, but her laughter came a little easier now. Diane even caught her singing softly to herself once, not the haunting tune from before, but something new, something hopeful. The community had changed, too. Neighbors who once whispered about the past now knocked on the door with cookies or notes. One of Angela's old classmates, now in high school, wrote her a letter, just a few simple words about how she was missed and how brave she was. Diane read it aloud to Angela, and they both cried. The house that had once felt like a monument to grief now felt like a home again. Diane repainted the walls, added plants to the porch, and cleared out the old boxes from the attic. It wasn't about forgetting, it was about letting light in. Healing didn't erase what had happened, but it softened the edges, gave space for new memories to grow. One afternoon, Diane and Kelly walked through the park where Angela used to play. Kelly held a small notebook. She had started writing everything down, not just for herself, but maybe one day for others. Families still looking. Parents who hadn't given up. Survivors who needed to know they weren't alone. Do you think she'll ever remember it all? Kelly asked. Diane shook her head gently. Maybe. Maybe not. But what she does remember, it's hers now. Not his. Not anyone else's. Angela joined them on the path, her steps steady, her eyes scanning the trees like she was finally seeing the world for what it was. Not a trap, not a cage, but a place she could live in. A place where she could belong. As they walked, Angela reached for her mother's hand. Diane took it, holding on tightly. This wasn't just the end of a story. It was the beginning of something new. For Diane, the biggest takeaway wasn't about justice or headlines or even survival. It was about listening. Really listening. To instincts, to whispers, to voices others dismissed. Angela had spoken in the only way she could, and because Diane listened, because she never stopped searching, her daughter came home. Not every story like this ends in reunion. Not every missing child finds their way back. But this one did. Because of courage. Because of faith. Because one mother refused to let go. And now, as the wind rustled the leaves above them, and the sky stretched wide and blue, Diane finally felt peace. Angela was home. And that was enough.